Hey guys, I just wanted to do a quick review on our fractions, decimals, and percents. We worked a fair bit on last time dealing with percents and kind of moving from percents to decimals and fractions. So I'm going to start off to kind of reviewing that. Only this time we're not going to have any pictures. So the first example that I could give you could look like this, where we have 3.25%. For the most part, we also know that 3.25% could also be identified as a decimal in a percent as 3.25%. And we know that because I can simply take my fraction part and go 1 divided by 4, and that's going to be the 1.25, and I'm adding 3 to that to give me 3.25. Now, knowing that's my percentage, you guys would all agree that this is the same as saying 3.25 out of 100. So we can see that it's kind of in a fraction state, except it's a decimal within a fraction. So I need to fix that. I need to prevent that from actually being a state where I have a decimal within my fraction. To do that, a quick and easy way to do that is if I actually look at the fact that I have two numbers behind my decimal place, I can actually simply multiply this by 100 and multiply the bottom by 100. Now the reason I might do that is just to allow me to make it easier to convert it into a decimal, because this now is going to give me 325 over 10,000. Now, we talked a fair bit last time when we looked at that denominator. If that denominator is a 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, we can kind of move those decimals, and we can kind of set that up. So when I'm looking at this, I know that 325 is smaller than 10,000, so I know I do not have any holes. And now all I have to do is think about where 325 would fit in my 10,000 spot. So this would be my tenths, hundredths, thousands, 10,000s, and I know the 5 has to go in that 10,000 spot. So now I can just fill in the rest of my number and put a 0 on anything preceding. So I end up getting a decimal of 0.035. So 0.0325 is the decimal of this fraction, or this percent. Now I can also turn around and take this fraction that I built here, that is the fraction, and I can actually take that fraction and I can actually reduce it now. So I have 325 over 10,000. Now I can see that it's based on the 25, so I'm going to try and divide the fraction by 25, top and bottom. I know the zeros are divisible by 25 in the 10,000. So when I set up that, I simply get 325 divided by 25, I get 13, and 10,000 divided by 25 is going to be 400. So I can actually have a reduced fraction. I can have a reduced fraction of 13 over 400. So therefore, I can basically say that 3.25% is exactly the same as 13 over 400, which is exactly the same as 0.0325. So I can kind of say that these are all the same, and that's our purpose. We want to be able to move from one to the other. So in this case, in the first case, I started out with a percent. In the second case that I'm going to do, I'm just going to show you guys that I can actually start with a fraction. So say I start with 2 and 5/8. You notice there's no percent behind that, so that's a fraction of 2 and 5/8. First thing I'm going to do, again, is I'm going to move it into a decimal form. And to do that, I'm simply going to go 5 divided by 8. I'm going to say it's 2 point, and I'm going to figure out what 5 divided by 8 is. I have 2 holes, so I have 2 in front of my hole. And I get 0.625 is 5 divided by 8, so this becomes 2.0625. That's my decimal version right there. Now, knowing that I have a decimal version, to move from a decimal to a percent, we simply times it by 100. So to figure out what it is as a percent, I'm going to times it by 100. I'm going to get 206.25. Now what I'm doing quickly, just so you guys know, is I'm looking at my decimal, and I'm being aware that if I'm multiplying by 10, it'd go here. If I'm multiplying by, it's not working. Give me a sec here. This was 0. No, it's not supposed to be a 0. Just give me a sec here, guys. I added something wrong here. Mess things up a little bit. So, looking at this again, this would be 2.625. 0 looks like 625. There we go. So 2.625 is my decimal. That's my decimal. And the reason my mistake I made was I put the 0, when I did it the 5 divided by 8, I added the 0 in there, and the 0 was a part of the whole. So it's 2.625. That is my decimal. Then I can move it to a percent, and again, I'm looking at simply timesing it by 100, and that brings me, and I'm looking at moving my decimals to do this, so this would be times 10 times 100. So I'm moving my decimal 2 places over. So when I do that multiplication now, I don't have to, I can just look at it and say I get 262.5, and because I times it by 100, I'm putting it as a percent. So this would be my percent. So it's a little bit easier than doing it the other way. So there's fraction, there's decimal, there's my percent. Now the last scenario that I can actually start with, which is pretty easy to do, is to start with a decimal. If I have something like this, I can quickly move from here. My easiest approach is to actually try and move this into a fraction. I simply look again, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, so I know that I have my number, 31, and it's over 1,000. So I can quickly move into a fraction. I then have to usually check and see if I can reduce, and in this case 31 is one of those prime numbers, so it's not going to reduce. So now I know this is my fraction, and I always go back to my decimal to figure out what my percent is. I'm simply taking my decimal and I'm timesing it by 100. Now, 31 times 100 would be 3.1%. So 3.1% we kind of recognize there. Now you can have partial percents, just so you know. You can have percents that are below a single percent. So if I had a decimal, and I'll just show you quickly, if I had a decimal 0.0003, if that was my decimal, well, again, we can move that into a fraction really easy. 1, 2, 3, 4, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths. So it's 3 over 10,000. Or, again, moving into a percent, I'm going to take my decimal and I'm going to times it by 100. Well, when I times it by 100, again, I move my decimal place 1, 2 places over, and I'm getting 0.03%. So that is actually a percentage, and we just have to be able to understand that we can have very small percentages of something. Okay? I hope it makes sense, guys. Let me know if it doesn't.